This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is an economic historian, a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and Business Administration at the University of Ariel in the West Bank. He's currently studying the role of Jewish American advisors, the role that they played in determining the course of the Israeli economy. Dr. Daniel Schiffman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much for having me.
So in your study, you focus on three instances of Jewish American economists advising the Israeli government: Abba Lerner in the mid-1950s, Milton Friedman in the late 1970s, and Stanley Fischer and Herbert Stein in the mid-1980s. These were all momentous periods in Israel's economic history, but before we explore them one by one, I'd like to ask you, by way of introduction, to talk about the general attitude of the Israeli establishment towards American economists and American economic philosophy, if you like, because the ideological spheres in which they were operating were very, very different.
I agree with you. There was, in general, an attitude of disdain towards American economic advisors. This was something that had to be tolerated because it was associated with aid from the U.S., it was associated with loans from the Export-Import Bank, which were important in the early years of the state. You had to live with it, but the fact is that Israeli officials didn't have much respect for the advice of foreign advisors. They thought that foreign advisors had no understanding of the actual realities in which they had to operate in. So as a general rule, you can say that the only time that they would take the advice of foreign advisors was during crises.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that basically it was imposed on them?
Sometimes American advisors were imposed. Each advisor is a different situation. Mm-hmm. Lerner was part of a group that was imposed as part of the package of being able to get U.S. aid. Mm-hmm. Friedman came as a private individual, and there were others. There's some Jewish advisors who were not American, who I'm not going to talk about today, mm-hmm. but who came as individuals. But then you had cases where the government brought somebody in.
Mm-hmm. So let's start with Abba Lerner. The first case study in your research, because that was in 1953 that he came to Israel, and of course we should bear in mind that it was years of grave economic crisis here in Israel, and also that the economy here was highly concentrated and socialist in essence, and barely self-sufficient, and that goes back to the international aid you were talking about earlier. So against this backdrop, in 1953, Abba Lerner, an Jewish-American economist, comes to Israel to advise Finance Minister Levi Eshkol. My question is, what was broken and how did it try to fix it?
Well, before we get into that, I just want to state it a little bit more precisely. Lerner came as part of a group called the Economic Advisory Staff, under the leadership of Oscar Gass, an American Jewish Washington economist who had helped Israel even before the beginning of the state. This was funded half by the Prime Minister's office and half by the United Nations. In 1955, this group was disbanded because the government didn't want it to continue, and Lerner stayed on for another year as advisor to Finance Minister Eshkol, and then he departed. So when Lerner arrived here in 1953, number one, we didn't yet have a Bank of Israel. Number two, we were dealing with huge trade deficits. That means that imports were much larger than exports. And the question was how to finance that. Where are we going to get the foreign currency to finance a trade deficit of 25% of the GDP, which is massive. And the government controlled many aspects of economic life. The government undertook most construction, most capital investment, either undertook it or financed it. The government had a very, very strong hand in allocating credit, what is called directed credit. The government decides who's going to get credit and on what terms, and can favor certain industries and disfavor other industries. And in general, the exchange rate system was very, very different than what we have today. And
but they saw it
things have changed.
But the government and the finance ministry saw it as the right way to do things, right? I mean, they didn't see it as something that was fundamentally broken and therefore should be replaced.
No, they had certain ideologies and the way that they managed agriculture with kibbutzim and moshavim, the way in which they managed the banking system, the way in which they dealt with exports and imports and foreign currency and the regulation of supplies. This was a war command economy. And then very often national security, as today. We have this also with the natural gas issue today. National security was used as a justification for economic policies that in some cases did not have to do with national security.
Okay, so what did Abba Lerner and the other advisors that he was part of have to say about that?
Well, the other advisors, that's a huge research project which we haven't yet undertaken, so let's stick with Lerner himself.
Why did you single out Lerner?
Why did we think about Lerner?
Single out.
Oh, why is he important?
Yeah.
Well, of all the members of the economic advisory staff, he was the most world-renowned as an economist. And I'm talking about as an academic economist. I don't mean business practical economist. I mean great academic theorist, one of the greatest of the 20th century, who many feel should have won a Nobel Prize. And he made fundamental contributions to many areas of economics. He was a follower of Keynes. In his youth, he was a socialist. Eastern European emigre to London, grew up as a child in London, got his education there, became a Keynesian, and then emigrated to the U.S. around 1937. And he had a very strong personal connection to Judaism and Israel. He'd grown up religious, but was no longer observant. But he felt more than a professional connection to Israel. He spent 3 full years of his life here as an economic advisor and another year as a founding dean of social sciences at Tel Aviv University, which we're not going to talk about today.
No, not today. Okay, so what did he have to say about the way the economy was run?
So he's a left-wing person. He's not, Milton Friedman, radical free market type of ideologue. He's not. He's coming here with an understanding that the government can and should intervene in certain matters to maintain full employment, to maintain low inflation, to maintain a fair and equitable distribution of income. So he's not Milton Friedman. And when he comes here, he sees a lot of things that he doesn't like. One of the things that he wants to fix is Israel's dependence on foreign aid. Among many other economists, they worried that the German reparations would run out. And the German reparations were helping to finance this huge trade deficit. Well, what do we do when the German reparations run out? We'd better prepare for that. So how do we prepare for that? Lerner said, let's expand exports, let's reduce imports, and let's improve the efficiency of labor, what we call labor productivity. So he was one of the first to put out a plan.
What does that mean? Labor productivity, longer hours?
It means he used the term working harder, but what it really means is that you want to get more product per hour that you work.
Okay.
We're struggling with that issue today, by the way. We're in a much better state than we were then, but compared to other industrialized nations, we have a big problem there. So he wanted to promote this plan for economic independence. That didn't go anywhere politically, with the Mapai establishment.
Yeah, why didn't it go anywhere? Well, first of all, how did they see Lerner's presence here? What was it, as you said in the beginning of today, did they see him as some sort of an imposition Someone who was there to give them unwarranted advice?
Well, Eshkol obviously did not, because Eshkol didn't need to retain him in 1955 to 56.
Yeah.
But the group that he was part of didn't get along well with the government. And we know that David Horowitz, the first governor of the Bank of Israel, did not get along at all with its leader, Gass. Mm-hmm. Lerner, he got along with better, even though Lerner and Gass, and this is our next, this is the next issue that I want to discuss, Lerner and Gass had very, very strong reservations about the Bank of Israel law in 1954. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a central bank, and for several years, a group under the leadership of David Horowitz, formerly Director General of the Finance Ministry, and then, as we know, the first governor of the Bank of Israel, this group was working on a draft proposal for the Bank of Israel law. And relatively late in the game, Lerner and Gass and the other economists came in. They didn't like what they saw. And I'd like to discuss Lerner's critiques. Lerner felt that too much power is vested in the governor, as we know, until 2010, when Stanley Fischer changed the setting of monetary policy, and he brought in a 6-member monetary policy committee. Until then, the governor alone set monetary policy. Lerner was against that, and he wanted to have a 5-man committee, of which 3 would be employees of the Bank of Israel and 2 would be outsiders or part-timers, very similar to what we have today. He also felt that banking supervision and foreign exchange management should not be housed within the Bank of Israel. I would say the jury is out on, there are different models around the world with regard to that. And more importantly, he was worried, and correctly so, that the government would use the Bank of Israel as a tool in order to promote its directed credit program. Again, directed credit means that the government decides who gets credit and on what terms. Mm-hmm. Bank credit, right? And most credit was directed credit controlled by the government. So
he feared it would be used for political purposes.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And what was the idea that...
So is it the contention was around the question of the independence of the Bank of Israel, essentially?
He felt it wasn't independent enough, but the reason was that so much power was given to the governor. But back to the directed credit issue, he felt that the Bank of Israel would be a tool that would use a carrot and stick approach. Mm-hmm. The carrot is that banks that cooperate with the directed credit program will be protected from competition. There won't be entry of new banks because the Bank of Israel will prevent that, and they'll get high profits. And to this day, we suffer from excessive concentration of the banking sector. And my friend Aryeh Krampf of the Academic College of Tel Aviv says that this has historical roots. The Bank of Israel is the one that caused this in the 50s. And the second thing is...
eventually, at the end of the day, Lerner lost the battle.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. Horowitz got his way. And Lerner was worried that there would also be a stick, that any bank that didn't cooperate, then the Bank of Israel would suddenly become much more strict with regulation with respect to that bank. So the banks would get the message, either you cooperate with our directed credit program or you're going to suffer.
So in 1956, he left embittered because nobody listened to him, essentially.
I don't know if he was embittered. He was disappointed. He actually wrote a farewell letter to Israel. But in order to discuss the farewell letter and his attempts to connect directly with the Israeli public, we have to discuss the wage issue. Lerner was highly critical of the Histadrut and of the wage system that it promoted. And he felt that, number one, there needed to be a wage authority alongside the finance ministry and the central bank. The wage authority would set wages according to economic principles, not politics and not...
Again, because the wages in the public sector, which was essentially the entire economy, were much higher than the economy could afford.
The wages were increasing too fast, ahead of productivity growth, and causing Israel to be uncompetitive abroad. Mm-hmm. And he also felt that wages were not being increased in a way that would attract people to the sectors that need workers and cause people to leave sectors that had too many workers. So the allocational efficiency of the economy, if we can use a technical term, it was not efficient. And he felt that we needed a wage authority instead of the current haphazard system that the Histadrut was running. And he also felt that the cost of living adjustment, which was a fundamental part of the Israeli economy for many, many years until it was finally abolished, I think in the 80s or the 90s, that the cost of living adjustment was causing great harm and had to be abolished totally. Not easy to get people to agree to that.
Unpopular.
Well, he actually wrote letters to the public, and he said, tell the finance minister, tell your union leader, I'm not a sucker, but I'm willing to give up the cost of living adjustment if other people are also willing to do so, because I understand that it causes such grave harm to the economy. And
did it really
Lerner didn't get many people to...
It didn't get many people. It didn't get his way. Did it really cause great harm to the economy?
Many economists think that the answer is yes. Lerner felt that reforming it wouldn't help. He felt that it needed to be completely abolished. The question is, how do you deal with compensating people for the fact that basic products have risen in price? Well, he had a scheme in place to try to help the poor, but he didn't want that if you devalue the currency, for instance, in order to improve competitiveness internationally, then import prices rise. He didn't want that to lead to higher wages, which defeats the whole purpose of the devaluation. This is a classic problem. We had this problem for decades, that if you compensate the workers for a devaluation, you're going to not gain very much from the devaluation.
But Israel in the coming decades, and I'm going to try and get to Milton Friedman now, in the late 1970s, it wasn't an industrial powerhouse, but it did relatively well considering the circumstances.
Yes, during the Yom Kippur War, and actually I should say that that's why the government felt free to ignore the advice of the foreign advisors. If the growth of the economy is so rapid, then we must be doing something right.
Yep.
So until 1973, we had fairly rapid productivity growth and rapid economic growth. In fact, if you compare us to countries that were in a similar situation in 1955, we grew the fastest. Mm-hmm. But after 1973, things went rapidly downhill. And not only did we do poorly, we did more poorly than other industrialized nations, because the oil shocks of 1973-4, that hit everybody hard. Mm-hmm. But we got hit even harder.
Mm-hmm. And then, also that there are political changes in Israel, and in 1977 comes to power the first right-wing government, Menachem Begin, the head of Likud, and the economic policy was also radically different from that of the previous Mapai and Labour governments. And then in 1977 comes, 77 or 78? 77, comes Milton Friedman, the guru of the free market, to advise to then Finance Minister Simcha Ehrlich. And at the time, I would assume that they see eye to eye, right? They're more on the same page than Lerner and Eshkol had been 25 years before.
Actually, Lerner and Eshkol had been together with Ben Gurion, had fought against a general wage increase in 1955 to 56. In the end, they lost. But right. In certain respects, Lerner was on the same page with Eshkol.
Okay.
But with regard to Begin gave the impression of having a radically different economic ideology than his Mapai or Labor predecessors. That was exaggerated.
Uh-huh.
Now, Ehrlich was the leader of the liberal faction, and with him it was more of an ideology. He was more committed. But in practice, what happened was that Begin, I know that I'm skipping Friedman and I'm telling you the outcome before we even start the story of Friedman, but the outcome was that after an initial free market-oriented reform in October 1977, there were no further reforms. The coalition partners didn't want, for instance, a cut in the budget. They wanted to continue with huge budget deficits, and there were no further reforms, and by November 1979, it was clear that this had been a disaster, and Ehrlich was out.
What you're saying is essentially that Begin was a closet socialist.
Well, Asaf Razin, who worked for Begin, Ehrlich, I should say, more. He was in the Ministry of Finance. Asaf Razin is a well-known professor of economics at Tel Aviv University, and he says that Begin was just like the Latin American populists. But in truth, I think we should go back to what Friedman said about Begin. He wasn't really interested in economics. Milton Friedman likened Begin afterwards to Winston Churchill, a great national leader who was always wrong on economics.
Okay. And what was really the background to his coming here?
Okay, so the Likud campaigned on a much more free market platform than Labor, although, again, the differences may have been exaggerated. Labor had made progress on reducing the trade deficit, actually, and reducing the government budget deficit under Prime Minister Rabin and Finance Minister Yoshua Rabinovitz, and actually Likud would squander all of that progress, unfortunately. But they came in with certain free market-oriented commitments that dated back actually to the 1950s. They had always wanted to free the exchange rate, what we call a float in economic parlance, let the free market determine the exchange rate and not the government. They also wanted to end currency controls, the idea that you're not allowed to buy dollars, you're not allowed to have a dollar bank account abroad. Remember the Rabin currency scandal?
That's the reason
Some
why
of
he
our
resigned.
listeners may be aware of the
1977.
scandal that Leah and Yitzhak Rabin had a bank account in Washington. In fact, the Likud opposition sympathized with him on that matter, and they wanted to decriminalize what many Israelis were already doing. Begin said it, Ehrlich said it, Deputy Finance Minister Fluman, Cheskel Fluman, also said it. And what happened was that they were committed to this before Friedman even arrived. Now, a few days after the upset, the Mahapach of May 17th, 1977, Ehrlich announced at his first press conference, he wasn't yet finance minister, but his close relationship with Begin made it virtually certain that he would be the finance minister. And he announced that Milton Friedman would be coming to advise the Israeli government. Now, Friedman didn't come specially for this. Friedman was already coming in order to be honored at the Hebrew University. He had won the 1976 Nobel Prize. He was going to be receiving an honorary doctorate July 4th, 1977 at Mount Scopus. And so they took advantage of his arrival here to get some advice. And he lengthened his planned stay in order to consult with the government. And while he was here, he spoke with Begin, he spoke with Ehrlich, he spoke with the Knesset Finance Committee.
What was his impression?
And he was on Israeli TV, and he also spoke before Hebrew University faculty, and there were some politicians who also attended that.
And what was his impression of the economic leaders of this country?
Well, he didn't want to discuss that in the media, but he wanted to tell people what his recommendations were. First of all, before he came, he got into trouble because he said that unemployment needed to be higher in Israel, and even
That's
if there
not a good start.
And he didn't. He was a great popularizer of economics, but here he didn't explain himself well, and he gave two different interviews to Israeli newspapermen with two different explanations of why unemployment in Israel needed to rise. And even if you're a professional economist, it's a little difficult to unravel it. And certainly the public didn't understand it. Now, what he didn't know was that there were elections for the Histadrut after the Knesset elections, and Begin and Ehrlich were campaigning for David Levy, who ultimately lost. And Yerucham Meshel, the incumbent, defeated him in a landslide. But they were hoping to capture the Histadrut after they had captured the formation of the government. And this was an embarrassment to Begin and Ehrlich, even though Ehrlich himself, as Shimon Peres had pointed out in the pre-election debate, Ehrlich himself had wanted to raise unemployment. But now Ehrlich was with Begin. They were saying, we're not for higher unemployment. Suddenly Milton Friedman, who's supposed to be advising them, is saying from America, we need higher unemployment. So he had to clarify his remarks the moment he landed here. Anyway, but it was silly, but it didn't really destroy his effectiveness. It was problematic, but I think there were other things happening as well. So he comes here and he proposes all these free market economic policies. And it was really a radical program for Israel to implement. And in retrospect, I don't think they could have ever implemented this all at once, even had they wanted to. And he said basically that we need zero inflation over 3 to 4 years. Inflation was about 35% at the time. Now, as we say in Hebrew, halavai, would it be so? We would have wished that it would have stayed at that level and not
but as you said, if he had really no cooperation from the government, you said that Begin wasn't really into these free market reforms. Ehrlich had to resign very soon after he was appointed. So really he was talking to the wind, wasn't he?
No, but that happened later. What happened was that they were initially receptive to his ideas, although the question was how receptive were they really? The truth is, and let's just quickly discuss what he wanted to do, to float the currency and abolish exchange controls, which Ehrlich and Begin were already working on. An extensive revision of banking regulation. He thought that after Beirut had declined as a financial center, Tel Aviv could take its place if they would fix the banking system. And all sorts of distortionary policies had to be abolished, directed credit and legal restrictions on firing workers, which in fact Lerner had been opposed to as well, certain housing regulations and
how much
all
of that,
sorts of stuff.
How much of that has been implemented?
It took a long time, but a lot of Friedman's vision eventually was implemented.
But 20 years on under Netanyahu, certainly.
Well, not just under Netanyahu. It was a gradual process that began basically in 1987 once the inflation dragon had been slain.
Right.
And the truth is that many of Friedman's ideas made sense only in a context of low inflation, not before. Today we know that it would have made sense had they fixed the inflation problem first. But as with the inflation running at 35%, maybe it was not a good idea.
All right.
Or almost certainly it was not a good idea to free the currency at that time.
All right, Dr. Daniel Schiffman, I'm afraid this is where we have to wrap things up because we've run out of time. And, of course, we can get to Stein and Fisher, your third case study later on another occasion. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming in today. You're an economic historian, a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics and Business Administration at the University of Ariel, and studying the role Jewish American advisors played in determining the course of the Israeli economy in the 1950s up to the 1980s. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
את הפאפאי אמשוך בדבש, אמתין לרוח שילחש, לא תוכל להתנגד אליי. אני צולל בתוך אש הטירוף, שביל הנר